The moment I saw Karen Whitmore's silver Lexus pull into my driveway with that distinctive squeal of brakes, I knew my peaceful Thursday afternoon in Millbrook, Indiana, was about to go straight to hell. I was under the hood of my 1967 Mustang, elbow deep in engine grease, when I heard her heels clicking across my concrete driveway. My workshop building, a modest 800-square-foot structure I'd finished constructing 3 months ago, stood proudly behind me. It was my sanctuary, painted a tasteful gray with white trim that matched my house perfectly. I'd spent 2 years planning it, saved up $15,000, and built it exactly according to the permits I'd obtained from the county. Nathan Zimmerman, Karen's voice cut through the afternoon air like nails on a chalkboard. We need to talk about that monstrosity you've erected on your property. I straightened up, wiping my hands on a rag, and turned to face her. Karen was the president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, a position she'd held with an iron fist for the past 7 years. She was 52, wore her blonde hair in that particular style that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," and had perfected the art of looking down her nose at people despite being 5'3". It's not a monstrosity, Karen. It's a workshop. I have all the proper permits from the county. I gestured toward the building. Everything's up to code, inspected and approved. She pulled out a manila folder from her oversized designer purse, the kind that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. The HOA Architectural Review Committee never approved this structure. According to our covenants, any external structure over 120 square feet requires HOA approval before construction begins. I felt my jaw tighten. I bought this property 4 years ago. I read through the entire HOA agreement. There's nothing in there about requiring approval for outbuildings on properties over 2 acres. My lot is 2.3 acres. There was an amendment passed 2 years ago, she said, thrusting a paper at me. All homeowners were notified. I took the paper and scanned it quickly. My address wasn't on the distribution list. I never received this. That's not the HOA's problem. Ignorance of the rules doesn't exempt you from following them. She pulled out another sheet. This is your fine. $5,000 for unauthorized construction, plus $200 per day until the structure is removed or brought into compliance. My hands clenched around the paper. $5,000, plus $200 daily. You've got to be kidding me. I don't kid, Mr. Zimmerman. The fine is effective immediately. You have 7 days to appeal to the HOA board, but I can tell you right now that your appeal will be denied. That building needs to come down, or you'll be paying fines until you're bankrupt. She turned on her heel and walked back toward her car, then paused. Oh, and the HOA board meeting is next Tuesday at 7. If you want to waste everyone's time pleading your case, you're welcome to attend. I watched her drive away, my blood pressure rising with each passing second. The workshop had taken me 6 months to build, mostly on weekends and evenings after my job as a mechanical engineer at the Anderson manufacturing plant. Every nail, every board, every window had been placed with care. It wasn't just a building, it was a dream realized. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, pulling up every document related to my HOA agreement. I'd purchased the house at 1247 Meadowbrook Lane in 2022, and the original covenants were clear. Properties over 2 acres had significant freedom regarding outbuildings. But there it was, buried in my email spam folder from 2 years ago, an email about important HOA covenant updates. The email had been sent at 2 in the morning on a Sunday, with a subject line that read "Community Newsletter," rather than anything indicating it contained legal changes to our HOA agreement. I opened the attachment and read through the amendments. They'd completely rewritten the rules about outbuildings, requiring HOA architectural approval for any structure over 120 square feet, regardless of lot size. The amendment had been voted on at a special meeting I'd never been notified about, and it had passed with a quorum of exactly 51% of homeowners. Convenient. I spent the next 3 days researching Indiana HOA law, consulting with 2 different attorneys, and preparing my appeal. The first attorney, a real estate specialist named Marcus Green, told me I had a decent case. The notification was inadequate, he said during our phone consultation. Burying significant covenant changes in a spam folder email with a misleading subject line could be argued as insufficient notice. But fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming. You might win eventually, but it could cost you $20,000 in legal fees. The second attorney, Patricia Howe, was more blunt. HOAs in Indiana have broad authority. Unless you can prove they acted in bad faith or violated their own procedures, judges usually side with them. You sign the agreement that allows them to amend the covenants. Whether the notification was ideal or not, they technically sent something to your email of record. I wasn't ready to give up. Tuesday evening arrived, and I drove the half-mile to the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center, a modest brick building that served as the HOA's headquarters and event space. The parking lot was nearly empty, just Karen's Lexus, a black BMW belonging to board member Richard Hayes, and a white Mercedes that belonged to board treasurer Linda Schwartz. Inside, the meeting room was set up with a long table at the front where the 3 board members sat, and rows of folding chairs facing them. Only 2 other homeowners were present, both there to complain about the state of the community playground equipment. I waded through 45 minutes of mundane HOA business. They discussed the upcoming summer pool opening, debated the merits of different landscaping companies for the common areas, and argued about whether the Halloween decoration rules were too restrictive. Finally, Karen looked at her agenda and said my name. Nathan Zimmerman is here to appeal his fine for unauthorized construction. Mr. Zimmerman, you have 5 minutes. I stood and walked to the front of the room, my folder of documents in hand. I built my workshop according to all county regulations and permits. I was never properly notified about the covenant amendments that would have required HOA approval. The email was sent at 2 in the morning with a misleading subject line, and it went to my spam folder. Did we have your correct email address on file? Karen interrupted. Yes, but then you were notified. Next issue. Wait, I said, my voice rising. I'm not done. The amendment requires a 75% approval vote for significant covenant changes. The minutes show it passed with 51%. That's not enough. Richard Hayes, a balding man in his 60s who ran a local insurance agency, flipped through his own folder. The bylaws were amended 5 years ago to lower the threshold to 51% for all votes. That amendment passed with 82% approval. I checked that. He was right, unfortunately. Fine. But my property is 2.3 acres. The original deed restrictions specifically state that properties over 2 acres have different rules regarding outbuildings. You can't just erase deed restrictions with an HOA vote. Linda Schwartz, a stern woman in her 50s who taught at the local high school, shook her head. The deed restrictions allow for HOA covenants to establish additional architectural standards. We're not erasing anything, we're adding requirements. It was like arguing with a brick wall. I tried 3 more approaches, citing Indiana HOA law, pointing out that they'd never enforced this rule against Tom Henderson who'd built a shed last year, and arguing that the fine structure was punitive rather than compensatory. Karen shot down each point with practiced efficiency. "Your appeal is denied," she finally said. "The fine stands. You have 60 days to remove the structure or obtain retroactive approval, which will require a $7,500 application fee and full architectural review. The daily fines will continue to accrue until the matter is resolved." I walked out of that meeting $7,500 poorer in potential fees, with a $5,000 fine already on my account, and daily penalties adding up. My hands were shaking as I got into my truck. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was personal. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept running through options in my head. I could tear down the workshop, but that felt like surrendering to tyranny. I could pay the application fee and hope they'd approve it retroactively, but Karen had made it clear she had no intention of approving anything. I could fight them in court, but that would cost more than the building was worth. Then I remembered something. Something important about the geography of Meadowbrook Estates, and why I'd gotten such a good deal on my property 4 years ago. Meadowbrook Estates was a development of about 60 homes built in the late 1990s on the eastern edge of Millbrook. The development sat on a peculiar piece of land, bordered on the west by State Route 32, and on the east by the old CSX railroad line that ran from Indianapolis up to Fort Wayne. When the developer had built the community, there were 2 ways to access it: the main entrance off State Route 32, which led directly into town, and a secondary access road that crossed the railroad tracks. Here's where it got interesting. My property, which I'd bought for considerably less than other homes in the development, sat right at that eastern edge. The previous owner had been an old railroad man named Walter Chen, who'd worked for CSX for 40 years. When he'd bought the property in 1998, he'd negotiated something special with the railroad company, a private crossing agreement. The crossing ran through the corner of his property, connecting the development's eastern access road to County Road 500, which led directly to Highway 69. Walter had explained this to me during the sale. "Most folks in the development use the State Route 32 entrance," he'd said. "But about 20 families on the eastern side prefer the railroad crossing route because it cuts 10 minutes off their drive to the highway. The HOA actually maintains the access road on their side, and I've maintained my portion. When I'm gone, the crossing agreement transfers with the property deed." I'd thought it was a quirky historical footnote at the time. I rarely used the crossing myself since I worked in Anderson, which was easier to reach via State Route 32. But now, sitting at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning, I realized what I had. I pulled out my deed and read through it carefully. Sure enough, there it was. The private railroad crossing agreement, established in 1998, giving the property owner the right to maintain and control access to a private grade crossing over the CSX railroad line. The agreement specifically stated that the property owner had full discretion over who could use the crossing, provided they maintained it in safe condition and complied with all railroad safety regulations. Walter had maintained it as a public courtesy, allowing the HOA and residents to use it freely. But the agreement didn't require that. It was his choice, and now it was mine. I spent the next week researching railroad crossing law, contacting CSX to understand my obligations, and consulting with a railroad attorney named Frank Morrison out of Indianapolis. Frank was a specialist in railroad right-of-way issues and had handled hundreds of private crossing disputes. "You have a legitimate private crossing agreement," Frank confirmed after reviewing my documents. "These were more common in the old days. As long as you maintain it according to railroad safety standards and don't interfere with rail operations, you can absolutely control who uses it. If you want to close it to everyone except yourself, that's your legal right. What about the HOA? They've been using it for 25 years. Doesn't matter. Prescriptive easement doesn't apply because the previous owner explicitly allowed it as a courtesy, not because they had a legal right to it. The moment you revoke that courtesy, they have no legal access across your property to reach the crossing. I grinned for the first time in a week. What do I need to do? Frank walked me through the process. I needed to notify CSX of my intent to restrict access, install proper gates and warning systems that met Federal Railroad Administration standards, post clear signage, and provide written notice to affected parties. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked methodically. I hired a railroad safety company to install a proper crossing gate system. Cost me $4,500, but it was worth every penny. The gates were professional grade with lights and bells, controlled by a keypad system. I notified CSX in writing, got their approval on my safety upgrades, and received confirmation that my crossing was in full compliance with all federal and state regulations. Then I had a sign made. A big, beautiful sign that read, "Private Railroad Crossing. No trespassing. Access restricted to 1247 Meadowbrook Lane only. Violators will be prosecuted." I installed the sign on a Saturday morning, right next to the new crossing gates, which I locked in the closed position. I'd set the keypad code to something only I knew. By Saturday afternoon, my phone was ringing. The first call came from Jennifer Patterson, one of the Eastern Side residents who used the crossing daily to get to her job in Fort Wayne. "Nathan, what's going on with the railroad crossing? There's a gate across it and a sign saying it's private." "It is private," I said calmly. "It's a private crossing agreement on my property. I've decided to restrict access. But I use that crossing every day. The highway route saves me 20 minutes. You're welcome to use the State Route 32 entrance like everyone else. This is ridiculous. I'm calling the HOA. You do that." The next call came from Richard Hayes. "Nathan, this is childish. You can't just close the railroad crossing." "Actually, Richard, I can. It's a private crossing on my property. I have the legal right to control access. I've confirmed this with both CSX and a railroad attorney." "The HOA will sue you for this." "On what grounds? It's my property, my crossing agreement. You have no legal right to use it. You've been using it as a courtesy for years, and I'm revoking that courtesy." He sputtered for a moment. "This is because of the workshop fine, isn't it?" "This is because I'm exercising my property rights, just like the HOA is exercising its authority over covenant enforcement. Seems fair to me." I hung up, feeling a satisfaction I hadn't felt in weeks. By Sunday morning, Karen Whitmore was at my door. Her face was red, her voice shaking with anger. "You will open that crossing immediately." "No, I don't think I will." "Do you have any idea what you've done? 20 families rely on that crossing. People have jobs they need to get to. You're adding 30 minutes to their daily commute." 40 minutes, actually, I corrected. "Because they have to go all the way down State Route 32 through town, then up to the highway. I've driven it. It's 40 minutes versus the 10-minute route through the crossing. You're being vindictive and petty." "I'm exercising my legal property rights, something I'm sure the HOA understands, given how vigorously you defend your authority to enforce covenants." She took a step closer, her finger pointing at my chest. "You listen to me. If you don't open that crossing, I will make your life a living hell. The fines on your workshop will continue. I will inspect every inch of your property for violations. I will make you wish you'd never moved to Meadowbrook Estates." I looked down at her finger, then back at her face. Karen, you're on my property threatening me. I'm going to ask you once to leave. If you don't, I'm calling the police. This isn't over, she hissed, but she turned and stalked back to her Lexus. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney demanding I restore access to the railroad crossing. I forwarded it to Frank Morrison, who sent back a detailed legal response explaining that the HOA had no standing to demand access to private property. The crossing agreement was between me and CSX, and the HOA had no legal interest in it. Meanwhile, the daily fines on my workshop continued to accrue. I was now up to $8,000 in total fines. I stopped paying my HOA dues in protest, which added more fines. The Eastern Side residents were in chaos. 20 families suddenly had to restructure their entire daily routines. People who'd planned their work schedules around a quick 10-minute shot to the highway now faced a 40-minute slog through town traffic. Parents who dropped kids at the Fort Wayne private school were late. Commuters missed meetings. Jennifer Patterson started a petition to force me to open the crossing. She got 45 signatures, which she presented at the next HOA meeting. I didn't attend, but Richard Hayes called me afterward. The board wants to negotiate, he said, his tone more conciliatory than before. I'm listening. We'll reduce your workshop fine to $1,000 and approve the structure retroactively if you open the crossing. No. What do you mean, no? We're offering you a reasonable compromise. You're offering me a reduction on an unjust fine for a structure that was legal when I built it. That's not a compromise. That's still a punishment. Here's my counter-offer. You waive all fines, approve my workshop as is with no fees, and issue a written apology for the inadequate notification about the covenant amendments. Then I'll consider reopening the crossing. That's not going to happen. Then we have nothing to discuss. I hung up and went back to working on my Mustang in the workshop they wanted destroyed. The engine was finally running smooth, purring like a kitten. 2 weeks later, things got uglier. Someone spray-painted "selfish" across my mailbox. I filed a police report and installed security cameras. The cameras caught 3 teenagers from the neighborhood toilet papering my trees the next week. I recognized them as the children of Eastern Side residents. I provided the footage to the police, who gave the kids a warning about vandalism. Karen Whitmore sent me another fine, this time for creating a hostile environment within the community. The fine was for $3,000. I didn't even bother responding to it. Then the local newspaper got wind of the story. A reporter named Sarah Collins from the Millbrook Gazette called me for an interview. I agreed, figuring public opinion might be useful. The article ran on the front page of the local section. Property rights dispute closes key railroad crossing. Sarah had done her homework. She explained the whole situation, from my workshop construction to the HOA fines to the crossing closure. She interviewed residents on both sides. Some supported me, particularly those who lived on the western side and didn't use the crossing. They saw it as an HOA overreach issue. Others, especially the Eastern Siders, painted me as a petty tyrant punishing innocent people. Karen Whitmore gave a quote that made my blood boil. Mr. Zimmerman is holding the community hostage because he doesn't want to follow reasonable architectural standards. This has nothing to do with property rights and everything to do with one man's ego. The article's comment section online was a war zone. People argued passionately on both sides. Someone created a Facebook group called Reopen the Meadowbrook Crossing, which got 300 members in 2 days. Someone else created a counter-group called Support Property Rights in Millbrook. Through all of this, I kept working, kept living my life, and kept that crossing gate locked tight. Then, in early June, about 6 weeks after I'd closed the crossing, something interesting happened. I received a call from a resident named David Murphy. David lived on the western side of the development and had no personal stake in the crossing dispute. "Nathan, you don't know me well, but I wanted to give you some information. Karen Whitmore doesn't speak for the whole community. A bunch of us have been looking into the HOA finances, and we found some irregularities." "What kind of irregularities?" "The kind that involves missing money. Karen's been president for 7 years, and she's had pretty much unchecked authority over the budget. Linda Schwartz, the treasurer, rubber stamps everything Karen wants. We're talking about significant amounts. The HOA takes in about $200,000 a year in dues, and a lot of it's unaccounted for." "How much is a lot?" "We think maybe $50,000 over the past 3 years. We're still digging, but it looks like Karen's been using HOA funds for personal expenses. There are receipts for things that don't make sense, payments to vendors that don't exist, that kind of thing." I sat up straighter. "Do you have proof?" "We're working on it. But I wanted you to know, because I think this whole aggressive enforcement thing with your workshop is part of a pattern. Karen uses fear and fines to keep people in line so nobody questions what she's doing with the money." "Who else is involved in this investigation?" David gave me 5 names, all homeowners who'd had their own disputes with the HOA over the years. They'd been quietly meeting and reviewing financial records that were technically supposed to be available to all homeowners, but which Karen made difficult to access. We're planning to present our findings at the next board meeting and call for a vote to remove Karen from the board. We could use your support. You've got it. The next board meeting was scheduled for June 15th. David and his group had done impressive work. They'd compiled a detailed report showing discrepancies in the HOA finances going back 4 years. There were payments to a landscaping company that didn't exist. There were receipts for community center repairs that were never made. There were catering expenses for events that never happened. All told, they estimated Karen had embezzled approximately $63,000 from the HOA over 4 years. Linda Schwartz appeared to be either complicit or negligently incompetent, signing off on expenses without proper documentation. On the evening of June 15th, the community center meeting room was packed. Word had spread about the financial investigation, and over 50 homeowners showed up, the largest turnout in the HOA's history. Karen called the meeting to order, looking nervous for the first time since I'd known her. She tried to rush through the normal business, but David Murphy stood up during the open comment period. "Madam President, I have a matter of urgent importance to bring before the board and the community." Karen's jaw tightened. "The comment period is for community concerns, not board business. This is a community concern. It concerns the alleged embezzlement of HOA funds by board members." The room erupted in murmurs. Karen banged her gavel. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Murphy. I hope you have evidence to back it up, or you'll be facing a defamation lawsuit." "I have plenty of evidence." David walked to the front of the room and plugged a USB drive into the projector system. He spent the next 20 minutes walking through the financial discrepancies, showing side-by-side comparisons of budgets versus actual expenses, displaying invoices from non-existent companies, and highlighting patterns of suspicious transactions. Karen tried to interrupt several times, but the crowd shouted her down. People wanted answers. When David finished, Richard Hayes looked pale. "I never approved any of these expenses. I signed off on budget categories, not individual transactions." "Which is exactly what Karen was counting on," David said. "She had signature authority for expenses under $5,000, and she made sure to keep most of her fraudulent transactions just under that threshold. Linda Schwartz stood up, her hands shaking. I want to make it clear that I had no knowledge of any improper activity. I reviewed the financial reports Karen provided, and they showed everything balanced. Because Karen was providing you with false reports, David said. He pulled up another document. Here's the real bank statements, which I obtained through a formal records request. And here's the reports Linda was reviewing. Notice the differences. It was damning. Karen had been cooking the books pure and simple. This is absurd, Karen said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. These are simple accounting errors, and you're twisting them into some conspiracy theory. Then you won't mind if we bring in an independent forensic accountant to review the books, David said. I think that's an excellent idea, said a voice from the back of the room. A man in a dark suit stepped forward. I'm Detective James Morneau with the Millbrook Police Department. I've been listening to this presentation, and I have some questions for Mrs. Whitmore. Karen's face went white. I don't have to answer anything without my attorney present. That's certainly your right, Detective Morneau said. But I'm going to need you to come down to the station for an interview regarding possible fraud and embezzlement. You can bring your attorney. The room was dead silent. Karen looked around, seeing the faces of her neighbors, people she'd ruled over with an iron fist for years, all staring at her with a mixture of shock and anger. This is Nathan Zimmerman's fault, she suddenly shouted, pointing at me. He started all of this because he can't follow simple rules. This is a witch hunt, Mrs. Whitmore, Detective Morneau said firmly. Let's go. Karen was led out of the community center, and the meeting dissolved into chaos. People were talking over each other, demanding explanations, calling for new elections. Richard Hayes, looking shell-shocked, called for order. In light of tonight's revelations, I'm calling for an emergency vote to suspend Karen Whitmore from the board pending a full investigation. All in favor. The vote was unanimous. Over the next few weeks, the investigation moved forward. The HOA hired a forensic accountant who confirmed David Murphy's findings. Karen had indeed embezzled $63,000 over 4 years, using a combination of false invoices, phantom vendors, and creative accounting. Linda Schwartz was found to be negligent but not criminally liable. She resigned from the board in disgrace. Karen Whitmore was charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't interested in going easy on someone who'd stolen from her own community. In August, Karen pleaded guilty to 6 counts of felony theft and fraud. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution plus penalties, totaling over $90,000. With Karen gone, the HOA board underwent a complete transformation. Richard Hayes stepped up as interim president and immediately called for a review of all pending fines and enforcement actions. My workshop case was one of the first things they addressed. At a board meeting in late August, Richard formally apologized. Nathan, the board has reviewed your situation. We believe the fine was improperly assessed. The notification about the covenant amendments was inadequate, and the enforcement was overly aggressive. We're waiving all fines against you and approving your workshop structure retroactively at no cost. We hope you'll consider rejoining the community in good standing. I stood up and nodded. I appreciate that, and I want to be clear, I never had a problem with reasonable HOA rules. My issue was with the way those rules were being weaponized. I'm glad we can move forward. About the railroad crossing, Richard continued. We understand it's your property and your right to control access, but we have 20 families who are really struggling with the extended commute. Is there any way we could work out an arrangement? I'd been thinking about this for weeks. I'm willing to reopen the crossing under certain conditions. First, the HOA needs to pay for half the cost of the safety equipment I installed, which comes to $2,250. Second, I want a formal easement agreement drawn up that clearly establishes this is a revocable privilege, not a right. Third, the HOA needs to contribute to annual maintenance costs. And fourth, I want a written guarantee that my workshop will never be subject to any future HOA enforcement actions. That seems reasonable, Richard said. Can we draft an agreement and have our attorneys review it? Absolutely. 2 weeks later, we signed a formal crossing access agreement. The HOA paid their share of the equipment costs, agreed to annual maintenance contributions of $500, and provided all the guarantees I'd requested. I programmed 20 access codes into the crossing gate system, one for each eastern side household that needed regular access. On September 1st, I unlocked the crossing gates for the first time in 4 months. Jennifer Patterson was the first one through, and she stopped to roll down her window. "Thank you, Nathan. I know this whole thing got ugly, but I appreciate you working it out." "We're all neighbors," I said. "We should be able to figure these things out like adults." Life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal. The HOA elected a new board in October, with David Murphy as the new president. They implemented new financial controls, including quarterly independent audits and multi-signature requirements for all expenses over $1,000. They also revised the covenant amendment process to require clearer notification and higher approval thresholds for major changes. My workshop became the place where I spent most of my free time. I finished restoring the Mustang, which won 3rd place at the Madison County Auto Show in November. I started taking on restoration projects for other people, turning my hobby into a profitable side business. Karen Whitmore's house went into foreclosure after she was sentenced. The restitution payments and legal fees had wiped out her finances. A young couple with 2 kids bought the property in December and immediately became friendly, active members of the community. I ran into Richard Hayes at the grocery store in early January, almost exactly 1 year after this whole mess started. "Nathan, I wanted to thank you again," he said as we stood in the produce section. "This whole situation, as ugly as it got, ended up being good for the community. We got rid of a corrupt board, implemented better financial controls, and people are actually engaged now. We have the highest meeting attendance we've ever had." "Sometimes it takes a crisis to force necessary changes," I said. "True." "And I have to ask, did you know about Karen's embezzlement when you closed the crossing?" I shook my head. "No idea. I just wanted to make a point about property rights and HOA overreach. The embezzlement was pure luck." "Or karma," Richard said with a smile. That evening I sat in my workshop with a beer, looking at the 1972 Chevelle I just agreed to restore for a client from Fort Wayne. The building was warm, well lit, and full of the tools and equipment I'd collected over the years. My sanctuary, my space, the place I'd almost lost because of one person's petty tyranny through the window. I could see the railroad crossing in the distance, its lights blinking as an evening freight train rumbled past. The crossing gates came down automatically, then rose back up after the train passed. Everything working smoothly, safely, legally. I'd learned something important over the past year. Property rights matter. Standing up to bullies matters. And sometimes, the best way to win a fight is to simply exercise the rights you already have, quietly and legally without backing down. The HOA fined me for my workshop building, so I closed the railroad crossing they used to reach the highway. It seemed like such a simple, petty act at the time. But it ended up exposing corruption, reforming a broken system, and teaching an entire community about the importance of accountability and proper governance. I took a long drink of my beer and smiled. The Mustang sat in the corner, gleaming cherry red under the shop lights, a testament to patience and craftsmanship. Sometimes you have to tear something completely down to its frame before you can build it back up properly. That was true for cars, and apparently it was true for homeowners associations too. My phone buzzed with a text from David Murphy. Board meeting next week. We're discussing new architectural guidelines. Want to be on the committee? We need someone who actually builds things. I typed back, sure. But only if we keep the rules reasonable. That's the plan. I set down my phone and went back to examining the Chevelle. It needed a lot of work, but the bones were good. With time and effort, it would be beautiful again. The workshop had cost me $15,000 to build, months of labor, and a 4-month war with an HOA president who thought she was above the law. But sitting here now, in this space I'd created with my own hands, I knew it had been worth every penny and every sleepless night. Outside, another train rumbled past, its whistle echoing across the Indiana countryside. The crossing gates went down, then up again. 20 families could get to work tomorrow morning in 10 minutes instead of 40, and my workshop stood solid and legal, exactly where I'd built it. Sometimes life has a way of working out, as long as you're willing to stand your ground and fight for what's right. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon you have isn't aggression or anger, but simply the quiet exercise of your legal rights. I raised my beer toward the window, toward the railroad crossing and the workshop and the whole complicated mess that had somehow resolved itself into something better. Here's to property rights, I said to the empty shop. And here's to homeowners associations that actually serve their communities instead of terrorizing them. The Chevelle needed new brake lines. I set down my beer and got to work. The sound of classic rock playing softly from the radio, the smell of oil and metal in the air, everything exactly as it should be in the end. The story wasn't really about a workshop or a railroad crossing. It was about what happens when ordinary people decide they've had enough of petty tyrants and broken systems. It was about accountability, consequences, and the power of simply saying no to injustice. Karen Whitmore would spend the next 4 years in prison thinking about the $63,000 she'd stolen and the authority she'd abused. The community would spend those same years rebuilding trust and creating something better. And I would spend them doing what I loved, in the workshop I'd fought to keep, teaching anyone who'd listen that property rights matter, that standing up to bullies is worth the fight, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's just living well, building things that matter, and refusing to be pushed around by people who think they're in charge. The Mustang's engine purred in the corner. The Chevelle waited patiently for its restoration. And outside, the railroad crossing blinked in the darkness, a reminder that sometimes the smallest piece of leverage, used correctly and legally, can move mountains. I had my workshop. The community had honest leadership. And justice, slow and imperfect as it sometimes is, had found its way to Meadowbrook Estates in Millbrook, Indiana. That was enough. That was everything.